Imagine a man standing inside the Kaaba, the most sacred building on earth, walking around it in the dead of night when no one else is there. He is not praying in the way you expect. He is not reciting verses in a whisper. He is staring at the stone walls as if they are about to speak to him. And somewhere in that silence, something breaks open inside him. He later says that in that moment he understood something so enormous, so overwhelming, that it would take him the rest of his life to write it down, and even then he would never fully succeed. That man was Ibn Arabi. And what he understood that night is still capable of changing your life today. If you are willing to sit with it, if you are willing to let it dismantle a few of your comfortable assumptions about who you are and what the world is. Most people who have heard the name Ibn Arabi know him as a mystic, a Sufi master, a man wrapped in centuries of legend, someone whose books are so dense that scholars spend entire careers on a single chapter. But strip away the intimidating reputation, strip away the thick robes of history, and what you find at the center of his teaching is something so simple that a child could feel it, and so profound that the greatest minds in history have never finished digesting it. Today we are going to sit with that one teaching, not a summary of his life, not a list of his books, one idea. The idea that once it lands in you, does not let you see yourself, other people, or the world in the same way again. Before we get there, you need to understand something about the world Ibn Arabi was born into, because it explains why his teaching hit like a thunderclap and why it still does. He was born in the year 1165 in Murcia, in what is now Spain, at a time when the Islamic world was a meeting point of philosophy, mysticism, science, and fierce theological debate. Everyone around him was arguing about God. Was God distant and unreachable, sitting somewhere beyond the heavens, watching creation from a throne of pure otherness? Was God simply the sum of moral rules, a cosmic judge with a ledger, tallying good deeds and bad deeds like an accountant? Was God knowable at all? Or was the very act of trying to know God an act of arrogance that should be punished rather than praised? These were not casual coffee shop questions. People built their entire lives, their entire societies, around the answers. Into this world stepped a young man who, according to his own account, experienced something as a teenager that no theological debate could explain. He fell gravely ill, so ill that his family feared he would die, and in that illness he had what can only be described as a direct encounter with the sacred, an experience so vivid and so certain that afterward, all the arguments other people were having about God started to sound like children arguing about the color of a sky they had never actually looked up at. He recovered from that illness a different person, and from that point forward, his entire life became a slow, deliberate unpacking of what he had touched in those fevered nights. There is a story from his youth that is worth pausing on, because it shows you the kind of mind we are dealing with, a mind that could hold both rigorous logic and overwhelming mystical experience, without needing to choose between them. As a young man in Andalusia, Ibn Arabi was brought to meet Averroes, the great philosopher whose commentaries on Aristotle would shape European thought for centuries. Averroes had heard about this unusual young man, who was rumored to have received extraordinary spiritual insight, and he wanted to see for himself. The story goes that Averroes asked the young Ibn Arabi whether the insights he had reached through mystical illumination matched what philosophers reached through pure reason. Ibn Arabi answered simply, yes and no. Between the yes and the no, he said, spirits take flight from their matter and heads are separated from their bodies. Averroes went pale. He recognized, in that single cryptic answer, that this young man had touched something that his decades of rigorous philosophical training had only approached from the outside. The way you can study the physics of water your whole life without ever having been swept into the ocean. That meeting stayed with Ibn Arabi for the rest of his life, and he later wrote about it with tenderness, not triumph, because he never saw the philosopher's path and the mystic's path as enemies. He simply knew, from that point forward, that some truths cannot be reached by argument alone. They have to be lived into. That conviction eventually sent him on a journey that would define the rest of his life, away from Andalusia, across North Africa, and finally to Mecca, the city that would give his greatest and strangest book its name, the Meccan Revelations, a work so vast that it fills dozens of volumes in its full edition, touching on theology, law, cosmology, psychology, and poetry, all woven around that single, central vision he could not stop trying to articulate. He wrote that he did not compose this work the way an ordinary author composes a book, sitting down with an outline and building an argument piece by piece. He described it as something that was given to him, almost dictated through him, in states of overwhelming inner opening that he could barely keep pace with as he wrote. Whether you take that description literally or see it as the language a mystic uses to describe the experience of sustained inspiration. The effect is the same. Here was a man who spent the final decades of his life pouring out, in exhausting, relentless detail, every possible angle on a single insight, because he seemed to believe that no matter how many pages he filled, he would never actually reach the bottom of it. And in a strange way, that endlessness is itself part of the teaching. The truth he touched was not a fact you could state once and be done with. It was a horizon that kept expanding the closer he walked toward it. Here is the teaching, stated as simply as I can manage, and then we are going to spend the rest of our time together unfolding what it actually means and why it matters to you, specifically in your actual life today. Ibn Arabi taught that all of existence is a single, unified reality, and that everything you see around you, every person, every tree, every grain of sand, every act of kindness, and every act of cruelty, is a reflection, a mirror, a face of that one underlying reality showing itself in countless forms. He called this Wadat al-Wujud, the oneness of being. Not onness as in everything is the same, not onness as in differences do not matter, but onness as in there is only one true source of existence, and everything that exists because it is borrowing its being from that single source. The way a wave does not exist apart from the ocean. Even though a wave has its own shape, its own crest, its own moment of rising and falling, sit with that image for a second, because it is going to come back again and again. A wave. Look at the ocean on a windy day. You see hundreds of distinct waves, each one different, each one with its own size, its own speed, its own particular way of catching the light. If you were a wave, you might believe you were entirely separate from every other wave around you. You might compete with the wave next to you. You might feel proud of your height or ashamed of your smallness. You might fear the moment you crash onto the shore and disappear. But zoom out, and what do you actually see? Water. One ocean. Every wave was never anything other than the ocean itself, temporarily taking a particular shape, temporarily rising up to greet the sky before settling back into the vast body it never actually left. This is what Ibn Arabi is asking you to see when you look at yourself, when you look at your neighbor, when you look at a stranger who wronged you, when you look at the sky at night. He is asking you to recognize that everything you see, including the person you call me, is a wave. Temporarily shaped, temporarily distinct, but never actually separate from the one reality underneath it all. And here is why this single realization, if it actually sinks into you and stops being just an interesting idea you nod along to, has the power to completely reorganize how you live. Think about how much of your suffering comes from a sense of separateness. Think about it honestly. The loneliness that creeps in at night when you feel like nobody truly understands you. The comparison that eats at you when you scroll through other people's lives and feel like you are falling behind in some race. Everyone else seems to be winning. The resentment that builds when someone hurts you and you cannot stop replaying it. Cannot stop seeing them as an enemy, as someone fundamentally other than you, someone whose well-being has nothing to do with your own. The fear that grips you when you think about death, about the ending of this particular wave that is you. Nearly all of it, if you trace it back far enough, is rooted in the felt sense that you are a separate, isolated fragment, cut off from everything and everyone else, fighting for scraps of meaning and safety in a universe that does not know you exist. Ibn Arabi is not offering you a comforting bedtime story to distract you from this pain. He arrived at his teaching through the same kind of direct, overwhelming encounter with reality that mystics across every tradition describe, and he spent decades working out its implications with the precision of a philosopher and the passion of a poet. What he is offering you is a description of how things actually are, one that, if you let it become real for you rather than just intellectually understood, dissolves the very foundation of that separateness at its root. Let's go deeper into what he actually meant, because it is easy to hear everything is one and turn it into a shallow slogan, the kind of thing printed on a poster with a sunset in the background. And Ibn Arabi would have been the first person to object to that flattening. He was extremely careful, almost obsessively careful, to say that oneness does not erase multiplicity. He was not saying that you and I are literally identical, that differences do not exist, that a rock and a human being are functionally interchangeable. He used another image for this, the image of a mirror. Imagine God, or the ultimate reality, or the ground of being, however you want to name it, as an infinite formless light. Now imagine that this light is reflected through countless mirrors, each mirror shaped slightly differently. Some curved, some flat, some cracked, some polished to perfection. The light passing through each mirror takes on the particular shape and color and quality of that mirror. The light in a red mirror looks red. The light in a distorted mirror looks distorted. But it is still always, only ever. The same one light, you in this teaching, are a mirror. Every person you've ever met is a mirror. Every living creature, every element of the natural world, is a mirror through which one underlying reality is expressing and revealing itself in an unrepeatable, particular way. This is why Ibn Arabi could look at the vast diversity of human beings, their different temperaments, their different faiths, their different ways of understanding the sacred, and instead of feeling threatened by that diversity, he felt awe. Because to him, every different mirror was not a deviation from the truth, it was another face of the truth, showing itself in a form that no other mirror could show it in. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was a mistake. Every shape existence took was necessary, because only that shape could reveal that particular aspect of the infinite. This is where his teaching becomes not just a metaphysical curiosity, but a direct instructions for how to treat other people. If every human being you encounter is a unique mirror reflecting an aspect of ultimate reality that no other person can reflect in quite the same way, then every act of contempt, every act of dismissal, every time you write someone off because they believe differently than you, look different than you, live differently than you are, in Ibn Arabi's framework, refusing to look into a mirror that was placed in front of you specifically so you could see something you could not see anywhere else. He is not asking you to approve of cruelty or to pretend that harmful behavior is fine because it's all one. He is asking you to recognize that your capacity to see the sacred should not be limited to the mirrors that happen to look, think, and worship exactly like you do. There is a phrase from Ibn Arabi that has traveled far beyond the world of Islamic mysticism and found its way into the hearts of readers of every background, because it captures this teaching in a single breath of poetry. He wrote that his heart had become capable of every form, that it was a pasture for gazelles, a monastery for monks, a temple for idols, the Kaaba for the pilgrim, the tablets of the Torah, and the book of the Quran, and that he followed the religion of love, whichever way love's caravan turned, for love was his religion and his faith. Read that again slowly. This was not a man abandoning his own tradition. Ibn Arabi remained devoted to his practice, his prayers, his scripture, until the end of his life. What he was expressing was something far more radical than religious relativism. He was saying that his heart had expanded to the point where it could recognize the sacred wherever it genuinely appeared, in whatever vessel it chose to appear in, without that recognition threatening his own rootedness in his own path. Think about what it would mean for your heart to become that capacious. Think about the people in your life you have written off, not because they hurt you, though that is its own separate matter we will come to, but simply because they see the world differently than you do. The relative with different politics, the neighbor with a different faith or no faith at all, the co-worker whose way of living seems foreign and even uncomfortable to you. Ibn Arabi is not asking you to abandon your own convictions. He held his own convictions with tremendous seriousness. He is asking you to consider that a heart which can only recognize truth when it arrives in a familiar costume is a heart that has shrunk, not one that has grown wise, and that the goal of a spiritual life is not to police the boundaries of who counts and who does not, but to expand your capacity to see, until eventually nothing can appear before you without you catching a glimpse of the one reality wearing yet another mask. Now let's turn to the part of this teaching that touches you the most intimately. Because so far we have been talking about the world out there, about other people, about the vast ocean of existence. But Ibn Arabi's teaching is not primarily about astronomy or metaphysics for its own sake. It is about you. It is about the person reading or listening to these words right now, and the story you have been telling yourself about who that person is. Most of us walk around with an unquestioned assumption, sitting quietly underneath everything we do. The assumption is that we are a fixed, separate self, a little bounded package of identity that exists independently, that has to protect itself, defend itself, build itself up, prove itself, and eventually lose everything when it dies. This assumption is so deeply embedded that we rarely even notice it operating. It shows up as the anxious voice that needs everyone to like you. It shows up as the ego that cannot stand being wrong in an argument. It shows up as the desperate need for achievement, for recognition, for some kind of proof that you matter, that you are real, that your existence has weight. Nearly the entire engine of human suffering runs on this quiet, unexamined belief that you are a separate thing that has to fight for its own significance in a universe that is otherwise indifferent to you. Ibn Arabi's teaching walks straight into the middle of that anxious machinery and asks a devastatingly simple question. What if that separate self was never actually real to begin with? Not in the sense that you do not exist, you clearly exist. You are having an experience right now, reading these words, feeling something in response to them. But what if the boundary you imagine around yourself, the wall that separates me from everything else, is not actually as solid as it feels? What if it is more like the boundary of a wave, real enough to give you a particular shape and a particular experience, but never actually cutting you off from the ocean you arose from and will eventually return to? This is where Ibn Arabi introduces one of his most powerful ideas, the concept of al-insan al-kamil, the complete human or the perfect human. This does not mean a flawless human in the sense of moral perfection, never making mistakes, never stumbling. It means a human being who has become fully transparent to the reality that is expressing itself through them. Someone in whom the mirror has been polished so completely that almost nothing distorts the light passing through it anymore. According to Ibn Arabi, this is not a status reserved for a handful of prophets and saints throughout history, locked away in some untouchable spiritual elite. It is the potential written into the structure of every single human being. He believed that human beings occupy a unique position in creation, precisely because we are capable, more than any other part of existence, of reflecting the totality of that one reality, all of its names, all of its qualities, mercy and justice, beauty and majesty, gentleness and power, held together in a single form. A rock reflects existence in one narrow way, a tree in another, an animal in another still. But a human being at their fullest potential can become a mirror polished enough to hold nearly the whole light at once. This is an extraordinary claim to sit with. It means that the sense of smallness you carry, the sense that you are just one insignificant person among billions, struggling through an ordinary life, unnoticed and unremarkable, is, according to this teaching, a kind of forgetting, not a lie exactly, because on the level of the wave, you genuinely are one particular, limited temporary form. But underneath that form, according to Ibn Arabi, is the entire ocean, and your task, the actual purpose woven into your existence, is to gradually remember that, to gradually polish the mirror, to gradually let more and more of that light shine through the particular shape that you are, without losing the particular shape that makes you. You notice what this teaching does not ask of you. It does not ask you to dissolve into some featureless blob of undifferentiated spirituality, abandoning your personality, your preferences, your particular way of loving and laughing and creating. Ibn Arabi was famously a poet, a lover of beauty, a man deeply attuned to the specific textures of life, the specific taste of a specific fruit, the specific face of a specific beloved. His teaching is not an instruction to erase your individuality in the name of oneness. It is an instruction to stop mistaking your individuality for a wall and start recognizing it as a window. The wave does not need to stop being a wave to know it is the ocean. It simply needs to stop believing the foam on its surface is the whole of what it is. Let's bring this even closer to your daily life, because it is easy to admire an idea like this in the abstract and then walk away unchanged. How does this teaching actually touch the ordinary texture of a Tuesday afternoon, the traffic jam, the argument with your partner, the bill you cannot quite afford, the ache of loneliness on a quiet evening? Consider the argument with your partner first, because this is where the teaching gets tested in real time. In the middle of a conflict, your nervous system convinces you that the person across from you is an obstacle and adversary, someone separate from you whose needs are in competition with your own. You dig in. You defend your position. You become, in that moment, absolutely certain that you are right and they are wrong, because the story of separateness demands winners and losers. Now imagine, just for a moment, actually letting Ibn Arabi's teaching enter that room with you. Imagine looking at the person you are arguing with and recognizing, not as a nice thought to calm yourself down, but as something you actually perceive in that moment, that this person is another wave of the same ocean you are, wearing a different face, carrying a different history, but never actually separate from the reality that is also expressing itself as you. This does not mean you suddenly agree with them. It does not mean the conflict disappears. But it changes what kind of conflict it becomes. It stops being a battle between two isolated fortresses and starts becoming something closer to a conversation within a single larger reality that is trying to understand itself a little better through the friction between two of its own expressions. Consider loneliness next, because this might be the place where this teaching offers its most immediate relief. Loneliness, at its root, is the felt experience of separateness taken to its most painful extreme. It is the conviction that you are alone in your particular experience, that no one else truly understands what it is like to be you, that you are, in some fundamental way, cut off. Ibn Arabi's teaching does not offer you a quick fix for the practical need for human connection. You still need friends. You still need people who show up for you. That need is real, and this teaching does not pretend otherwise. But underneath the practical loneliness, there is often a deeper, more metaphysical loneliness, a sense that existence itself has abandoned you, that you are a stranger in the universe. And it is precisely this deeper loneliness that the teaching of oneness speaks to directly. If the ground of your own being is the same ground of being underlying everything else that exists, then you were never actually a stranger here. You were never actually cut off from the source of everything. The loneliness was real as an experience, but it was built on a misunderstanding about what you actually are. Consider your fear of death, because this is perhaps the deepest fear underneath most of our smaller fears, and it is exactly what Ibn Arabi's teaching was built to address, directly and without flinching. If you believe you are a separate, isolated self, then death is annihilation, the total end of the only thing you ever were. No wonder people spend their entire lives running from the thought of it, building distractions, chasing legacies, trying to leave some mark that will outlast the body. But if you actually are a wave, and the wave was never anything other than the ocean, then what does it mean for a wave to crash onto the shore? It does not mean the ocean has lost something. It means the water has simply changed its shape again, releasing the particular form it was holding for a while, and returning to the vastness it never actually left in the first place. This is not a promise designed to make you stop grieving. Grief for the people we love is real and human, and Ibn Arabi never asked anyone to bypass it. But grief and this deeper recognition are not enemies. You can weep for the disappearance of a particular, beloved wave, and at the same time know in the depths of your being that nothing true was ever actually lost, because nothing true was ever actually separate to begin with. Let's pause here and address something important, because a teaching this powerful can be misunderstood in ways that actually cause harm if it is taken too casually. Some people encountering an idea like everything is one start to use it as an excuse to avoid responsibility. If everything is ultimately one, does it matter what I do? If my actions and someone else's suffering are somehow part of the same reality, does morality even mean anything anymore? Ibn Arabi would have rejected this conclusion completely, and it is worth spending real time on why, because this is exactly the point where a beautiful teaching, half understood, can turn into something dangerous. Ibn Arabi did not teach that distinctions do not matter. He taught that distinctions are themselves an expression of the one reality, and that reality has chosen, deliberately and purposefully, to differentiate itself into a world of multiplicity, a world where some actions cause harm and others cause healing, where cruelty and compassion are genuinely different things with genuinely different consequences. The mirror image actually helps clarify this. A cracked, dirty mirror still reflects light, but it reflects it poorly, distorted, dim. A clean, polished mirror reflects it brilliantly. Both mirrors are made of the same underlying substance. Both are ultimately never separate from the light passing through them. But that does not mean it is irrelevant whether a mirror is polished or left to crack and gather dust. In fact, precisely because the light matters so much, the condition of the mirror matters enormously. Your actions in the world, your choices, your treatment of other people are not rendered meaningless by the teaching of oneness. They are given a deeper meaning, because every act of cruelty is understood as fogging up a mirror that was meant to reveal something sacred. And every act of compassion is understood as polishing that same mirror, letting more light through, allowing reality to see itself more clearly through you. This is why Ibn Arabi, despite the audacity and scope of his metaphysics, remained throughout his life a man devoted to disciplined practices, to prayer, to ethical conduct, to the concrete, unglamorous work of living rightly. He did not treat the doctrine of oneness as a permission slip to abandon effort. He treated it as the deepest possible reason to take your conduct seriously, because your conduct is not just about you managing your own isolated moral scorecard. It is about how faithfully you are letting the one reality shine through the particular form that you are. When you lie, when you betray someone's trust, when you humiliate another person to make yourself feel bigger, you are not just harming an external, separate other. You are clouding the very mirror through which existence was hoping to see itself a little more clearly. And when you forgive, when you show up for someone in their suffering, when you choose honesty even when it costs you something, you are doing more than being a good person in some abstract ethical sense. You are participating, in a very real and immediate way, in the ongoing act of creation revealing its own beauty to itself. There is another dimension of this teaching that deserves careful attention, because it explains why Ibn Arabi has remained relevant across such a staggering range of cultures, centuries, and even religious boundaries far beyond his own tradition. His teaching of oneness was never meant to be a private philosophical possession locked inside one community. He explicitly taught that the divine reality reveals itself through every sincere path that seeks it, that the forms of worship differ, the languages differ, the rituals differ, but that underneath the differences, sincere seekers across traditions are often reaching toward the same horizon, even if they describe what they see there in different words. This is part of what gave rise to that famous line about his heart becoming a pasture for gazelles and a temple for idols. He was not diminishing his own faith by saying this. He was expanding the reach of what his own faith, understood at its deepest level, was actually capable of recognizing. Think about what this means for how you move through a world that is constantly pressuring you to pick a side, to decide who is in your tribe and who is outside it, to see difference as a threat rather than as an invitation. We live in an age of intense polarization, where entire identities are built around opposition to whoever is perceived as different, where algorithms profit from your outrage at people who see the world differently than you. Ibn Arabi lived through his own version of a divided world, a world of crusades and conquests and sectarian conflict, and rather than retreating into a smaller, safer, more defended identity, he moved in the opposite direction. He expanded. He let his heart grow large enough to hold difference without needing to erase it or be threatened by it. This is perhaps one of the most urgently needed teachings a modern listener can take from him, not as an abstract nicety, but as a practical discipline for how to live in a fractured world without becoming yet another fragment adding to the fracturing. Let's return one more time to the image of the mirror, because there is a final layer to it that we have not yet uncovered, and it might be the most important one of all for your own life. So far we have talked about other people as mirrors, about the world as a mirror. But Ibn Arabi's teaching goes one step further and turns the mirror back toward you, in a very specific and startling way. He taught that just as the world is a mirror in which the divine reality sees itself reflected, you specifically are also a mirror in which you have the potential to see that same reality reflected back at yourself. In other words, the deepest truths you are seeking outside yourself, in scripture, in teachers, in mystical experiences, in grand cosmic explanations, are also simultaneously available to you through the simple, direct act of turning your attention inward and looking honestly at your own being. This is why so much of the practice associated with Ibn Arabi's teaching is not about accumulating more information, more doctrine, more explanations. It is about purification, about the slow, patient work of removing whatever distorts your own inner mirror, the grudges you carry, the fears you have never examined, the habits of self-deception you have grown comfortable with, the noise of constant distraction that keeps you from ever sitting still long enough to notice what is actually there underneath all the noise. Every tradition of contemplative practice, in every culture across history, has arrived at some version of this same insight, that the obstacles to seeing reality clearly are not primarily intellectual. They are not solved by reading one more book or hearing one more lecture. They are removed through the quiet, unglamorous, daily discipline of attention, honesty, and care. So what does this actually look like in practice for you starting today if you take this teaching seriously, rather than just admiring it as an interesting idea? It does not require you to abandon your life, move to a monastery, or spend decades studying medieval texts in their original language. Though if that calls to you, it is a beautiful path. It starts much smaller than that, and much closer to home. It starts with a pause. The next time you feel contempt rising in you toward another person, whether it is a stranger who cut you off in traffic, or someone in your life whose choices you cannot understand, or even a version of a group of people you have never bothered to actually meet as individuals. In that pause, you ask yourself a simple question inspired by everything we have covered today. What if this person exactly as they are is a mirror, reflecting something about existence that I have not yet learned to see? You do not have to force yourself into approval of everything they do. You are simply interrupting the automatic slide into treating them as fundamentally other, fundamentally separate, fundamentally beneath your attention or your compassion. It continues with how you treat your own inner life, the parts of yourself you are ashamed of, the mistakes you have made, the ways you have fallen short of who you want to be. So often, we treat our own flaws the way we treat strangers we have decided to write off, with contempt, with dismissal, with a refusal to look closely. Ibn Arabi's teaching invites you to extend the same expanding heart toward yourself that he extended toward the whole of creation. Not an excuse for your failures, but an honest willingness to look at them clearly, to polish that particular corner of the mirror rather than covering it up and pretending it is not there. It continues too, in how you handle your fear of insignificance, that quiet, background anxiety that tells you your life does not matter enough, that you have not achieved enough, been noticed enough, mattered enough. According to this teaching, your worth was never actually a function of your achievements, your recognition, or your comparison to anyone else's wave. It was built into the simple, undeniable fact that existence itself chose to take your particular shape, chose to express itself as you, in a way that has never happened before in the history of the universe and will never happen again. That is not a small thing, dressed up in comforting language. That is the literal claim at the center of this teaching, that your particular existence is one irreplaceable face of reality, seeing itself for the first and only time through your eyes. And it continues, finally, in how you hold the ordinary, unremarkable moments of your life, the ones that do not feel spiritual at all. The dishes, the emails, the waiting rooms, the small talk. Because if the teaching of oneness is true, it cannot only be true in the mountaintop moments, the meditative states, the rare flashes of transcendence. It has to be true or it is not really true at all. In the most boring, ordinary moment of your day. The reality that Ibn Arabi encountered in the depths of his illness as a young man, the reality he spent the rest of his life trying to describe in thousands of pages, is not hiding somewhere far away, reserved for saints and mystics in states of ecstasy. It is, according to his own insistence, as present in the cup of water in front of you right now as it is in the most exalted spiritual experience anyone has ever had. The only difference is whether you have polished your mirror enough, in this particular moment, to notice it. There is one more dimension of this teaching that deserves your attention before we come to a close, because it touches something almost everyone quietly longs for and rarely names directly: the desire to create, to make something, to leave some trace of meaning in the world through your own hands or your own voice. Ibn Arabi had an entire, elaborate teaching about what he called the imagination. Not imagination in the modern dismissive sense of make-believe, of things that are not real, but imagination as an actual intermediate realm of reality. A bridge between the purely spiritual and the purely physical, where meaning takes on form and form carries meaning. He believed that when a poet writes a true line of poetry, when a craftsman shapes a bowl with care, when a mother sings a wordless melody to soothe her child, something of that same one reality is passing through the imagination and taking on a shape it did not have before. Creation, in his framework, was not something that happened once, long ago, and then stopped. It was continuous. Existence is always in the process of bringing forth new forms, and human beings, uniquely among all creatures, participate directly in that ongoing creativity every time they make something true. This matters enormously for how you might think about your own creative impulses, the ones you have perhaps dismissed as impractical, as hobbies, as indulgences you cannot justify next to the demands of a productive life. If Ibn Arabi is right, the urge you feel to write, to build, to paint, to compose, to design, to tell a story, is not a distraction from your spiritual life. It is one of the most direct channels available to you for participating in the same act of self-revelation that the whole universe is engaged in. Every mirror you polish, every honest thing you make and offer to the world, is one more place where the light gets to see a little more of itself. This does not mean everything you create needs to be explicitly religious or even conventionally beautiful. It means that the sincerity behind the making matters more than the subject matter, because sincerity is what keeps the mirror clean enough for something real to pass through it. Consider, too, what this teaching does to your relationship with gratitude, because gratitude, properly understood, is one of the most direct doorways into the experience of oneness that ordinary life offers you. When you are truly grateful, not performing gratitude, not reciting a list because you feel you should, but actually struck, for a moment, by the sheer improbable gift of something in front of you, a warm meal, a friend's laughter, the particular color of the sky at dusk. What is actually happening in that moment is a brief, spontaneous collapse of the wall between you and what you are perceiving. You stop experiencing the sunset as an object out there, separate from you, being observed by a separate self in here. For a moment, there is just the experience itself, whole, undivided, complete. Mystics across nearly every tradition have pointed to gratitude and wonder as some of the most reliable, ordinary doorways into the very reality that takes years of discipline to reach through other means. Ibn Arabi would tell you that these moments are not accidents, and they are not merely psychological tricks of brain chemistry. They are brief, unguarded glimpses of what is actually always true, breaking through the noise of your habitual sense of separation. This brings us back to where we began, to a man walking around the Kaaba in the middle of the night, undone by something he could not fully explain, spending the rest of his life trying anyway. What he left behind was not a tidy formula, not a simple technique you can master in a weekend. It was an invitation, repeated across thousands of pages, in poetry and prose, in careful argument and ecstatic verse, to see differently, to stop mistaking the shape of the wave for the whole of the ocean, to recognize that the boundary you have built around yourself, the one that makes you feel isolated, competitive, afraid, and alone, was never as solid as it felt. To let your heart grow large enough to hold a gazelle's pasture and a monastery and a temple and a holy book all at once, without losing yourself in the process, but rather, finally, actually finding yourself for the first time. There is one final piece of this teaching that we have to address honestly, because it would be dishonest to end here without speaking directly to suffering, real suffering, the kind that does not resolve neatly with a beautiful metaphor about oceans and waves. Ibn Arabi did not live an untroubled life. He was exiled from his homeland. He buried people he loved. He wrote during times of war, displacement, and profound uncertainty about whether the world he knew would survive the century. He was not a man protected from pain by his philosophy. He was a man who walked directly through pain and came out the other side still holding to this teaching, which tells you something important about what this teaching actually is and is not. It is not a technique for skipping past suffering. It is not spiritual bypassing, the modern habit of using lofty ideas to avoid feeling the full weight of what hurts. When Ibn Arabi says that everything is a face of the one reality, he includes grief in that. He includes loss. He includes the nights when nothing makes sense and the ocean feels very far away, and all you can feel is the particular, isolated, aching shape of your own wave, crashing again and again against a shore that never seems to give you rest. What this teaching offers in those moments is not an escape hatch but a companionship, a way of understanding that even your suffering has not placed you outside the one reality, has not exiled you from the ocean, has not made you less connected to the source of all things than you were before the pain began. The wave in its most violent, chaotic breaking is still entirely and completely water. Nothing about its turbulence separates it from what it fundamentally is. This is different from saying suffering does not matter, or that you should not seek help, community, rest, and healing when you are in pain. You absolutely should. And Ibn Arabi, who built his entire teaching around expanding capacity and connection, would have been the last person to tell a suffering human being to simply meditate their way out of needing other people. What this teaching gives you instead is a floor beneath the pain, a quiet, steady conviction that even in your most broken moment, you have not fallen out of existence. You have not become an orphan of the universe. You remain, in your suffering exactly as much as in your joy, an irreplaceable form through which the one reality is. In that moment, choosing to feel the full weight of what it means to grieve, there is strangely a kind of dignity in that. Your pain is not proof of your separateness. It is proof that you are alive enough, connected enough, open enough to feel the full cost of loving things that do not last forever. You do not need to accept every detail of Ibn Arabi's cosmology to let this teaching change something in you. You do not need to become a scholar of Islamic mysticism. Though if this has sparked something in you, that door remains wide open and endlessly rewarding. All you need to do is carry one question with you as you leave this moment and walk back into your ordinary life. The next time you look at another person, a stranger, a loved one, someone who has hurt you, someone you have never bothered to truly see, ask yourself, quietly, honestly, what if this is a mirror? What if the light passing through them is the same light passing through me? What if the separation I feel so certain of is the one thing in this entire universe that was never actually real? Carry that question into your next conversation. Carry it into your next argument. Carry it into the quiet moments when no one is watching and you are simply alone with your own thoughts, wondering if any of this matters, wondering if you matter. According to a man who once stood shaking in the dark, staring at the walls of the most sacred building he knew, until something in him broke open and never fully closed again, you were never separate to begin with. You were always the ocean, wearing, for a little while, the particular and irreplaceable shape of a wave. And the moment you actually remember that, not as an idea you have heard, but as something you feel in your bones, is the moment everything, quietly, without any fanfare at all, begins to change.